AAA gaming didn't just happen overnight. The industry's biggest blockbusters were built on the back of risk-takers, innovators, and games that redefined what players expected from big-budget titles. These weren't just good games, they set new standards for better or worse, shaping what we now call AAA. Some are still legendary today, while others reveal how uneven the climb to the top really was. If you could, please subscribe and ring the bell. Also leave a like if you like the content. Stealth was there before Metal Gear Solid hit the PlayStation, but never like this. Hideo Kojima didn't just make a stealth game. He created something that blurred the line between cinema and gameplay. The voice acting, the camera work, the dramatic cutscenes, it all felt bigger than the cartridge-based games of the past. Suddenly, video games weren't just about beating levels. They were telling stories with the same flair as Hollywood action thrillers. The brilliance of MGS came from how it trusted players to think differently. Instead of mowing down waves of enemies, you were rewarded for sneaking, listening, and strategizing. The level design turned every room into a puzzle. And with tools like the cardboard box or thermal goggles, the game invited experimentation in a way that felt fresh and exciting. It wasn't just about reflexes. You needed to be a little smart. And then there were the boss fights, each one designed like a set piece with unique mechanics, from the mind-bending duel with Psycho Mantis to the tense sniper showdown with Sniper Wolf. These moments were more than just battles. But like any ambitious project, it wasn't perfect. The camera angles could be clunky, and the controls often fought against you. Long cutscenes tested patience, and Kojima's writing, equal parts genius and absurd, could swing wildly from profound commentary to over-the-top melodrama. Yet those quirks became part of its charm. This game showed that AAA games could be cinematic experiences without losing interactivity. It proved that voice acting mattered, that storytelling could be ambitious, and that gameplay could carry themes far beyond shoot the bad guys. In many ways, it was the moment where gaming showed that it can stand shoulder to shoulder with other mediums. The fact that players are still debating its story, characters, and themes more than 2 decades later shows just how much of an impact it had. When Crysis released on PC, it wasn't just another shooter. It became the measuring stick for gaming hardware. Being able to run it wasn't a joke. It was the question that haunted PC owners for years. Crytek didn't just build a game, they built a showcase of cutting-edge graphics that pushed machines to their breaking point. And in doing so, they redefined what AAA ambition looked like. Beyond the memes, though, Crysis offered more than pretty pixels. The open-ended sandbox design let players tackle missions however they wanted. Cloak to sneak past enemies, use strength to punch through obstacles, or go loud with heavy firepower. The Nanosuit turned every encounter into a playground. Levels were sprawling and reactive, giving players freedom that few shooters dared attempt. It wasn't just about looking real, it was about playing differently each time. Of course, ambition came at a cost. Many players couldn't even run the game properly, leaving them frustrated or excluded. The story, while serviceable, leaned heavily on sci-fi cliches, and the second half lost focus once aliens replaced soldiers as the main threat. Even fans admit that Crysis sometimes felt more like a tech demo than a fully fleshed-out experience. Yet its impact can't be denied. Crysis showed that AAA wasn't just about scale or spectacle. It was about technological leaps. It raised expectations for graphics, physics, and player freedom in ways that influenced everything from open-world shooters to sandbox design in general. Looking back, it's easy to critique the rough edges, but in 2007, Crysis was a glimpse of the future. It reminded players and developers alike that AAA games should dare to be ambitious, even if that means not everyone can keep up. When Breath of the Wild arrived, the Zelda series was already legendary, but also predictable. Dungeons, gadgets, linear progression. Fans knew what to expect. Nintendo blew all of that up in one bold move, creating an open-world experience that redefined not just Zelda, but the way we think about AAA design altogether. The brilliance of Breath of the Wild wasn't in its size. Other games had bigger maps, but in how it trusted players. From the moment you left the Great Plateau, nothing stopped you from climbing a mountain, gliding into a hostile region, or even heading straight to Ganon if you were brave enough. The systems-driven design made the world feel alive. Grass caught fire, lightning struck metal, and physics puzzles emerged naturally. It was freedom in the purest sense, the kind of gameplay that made experimentation just as rewarding as progression. Visually, it embraced style over raw horsepower. Its painterly look has aged better than many realistic games of the time, proving that AAA polish doesn't always mean chasing photorealism. And the understated soundtrack, which shifted dynamically as you explored, gave the game a meditative quality that few blockbusters ever attempt. That's not to say it was flawless. Traditional dungeon fans felt shortchanged by the divine beasts, which lacked the complexity of past temples. Weapon durability frustrated many, turning epic loot into disposable tools. Some even found the sparse storytelling underwhelming compared to earlier Zelda entries. But these trade-offs were part of Nintendo's gamble, to prioritize freedom over formula. And it worked. Breath of the Wild didn't just modernize Zelda. It redefined what a blockbuster could feel like. It set a new bar for open-world design, inspiring countless imitators, but few have captured the same sense of curiosity and discovery. When Grand Theft Auto 3 released on PS2 in 2001, it didn't just feel like another sequel. It felt like the industry had entered a new era. Suddenly, players weren't just moving from mission to mission. They were dropped into Liberty City, a living sandbox where chaos, exploration, and freedom collided in a way no one had ever seen on a console. Before this, open worlds were often flat backdrops. GTA 3 turned the entire city into a playground. The appeal wasn't just about driving from point A to B. It was about everything you could do along the way. Jack a car, evade cops, tune into satirical radio stations, or simply cause havoc for hours on end. Missions gave the game structure, but the real magic came from how much the player could bend the rules. That freedom, messy as it was, defined a new kind of AAA experience, one where scope and choice mattered as much as story. Of course, it had flaws. Liberty City was groundbreaking, but it was also empty by today's standards. The AI was limited, the shooting mechanics were stiff, and the silent protagonist, Claude, made story beats feel kinda hollow. Even at the time, critics noted the game's rough edges and controversial reliance on shock value. Yet none of that stopped it from becoming a phenomenon. What it did was prove that open worlds weren't just possible, they were the future. It inspired countless games, from Saints Row to Sleeping Dogs, and even influenced non-crime titles that adopted sandbox elements. More importantly, it forced the industry to think bigger. Games could no longer just be levels strung together. They had to be worlds players could live in. Looking back, GTA 3 is clunky, sometimes crude, and clearly a product of its time. But Cracked opened the door to the modern open world formula, and AAA gaming hasn't been the same since. When World of Warcraft launched in 2004, nobody could have predicted just how massive it would become. Sure, MMOs already existed. EverQuest and Ultima Online had their followings, but WoW took the genre mainstream in a way no one else managed. Blizzard didn't just build a game, they built a second life. For years, logging into Azeroth wasn't just playing, it was living in a world full of millions of other players, each shaping the experience in real time. The genius of WoW was accessibility. It took the hardcore complexity of older MMOs and smoothed it out. Quest markers, streamlined combat, and a more approachable art style made it easy for newcomers to dive in. At the same time, the in-game raids and PvP kept veterans grinding for months on end. It hit that perfect balance. Casual players could feel accomplished, while hardcore guilds obsessed over every boss mechanic. But it wasn't flawless. Early WoW was notorious for its grind, with players spending hours farming materials or camping rare spawns. Raids often demanded absurd amounts of time, locking out those without the commitment. And while the social element was powerful, it also bred toxicity, guild drama, loot disputes, and endless gatekeeping were part of the package. Yet even these flaws fed into the cultural phenomenon. At its peak, it had over 12 million subscribers, dominating the conversation in a way few games ever have. It didn't just define what an MMO could be. The ideas of constant content updates, massive expansions, and a subscription model set the blueprint for the games-as-a-service model that still drives the industry. Even today, when its influence has waned, the legacy is untouchable. World of Warcraft wasn't just a game. It was a cultural force. For better or worse, it proved that AAA could extend beyond a single release and become a world players never wanted to leave. Mario had been everywhere by 2017. Side-scrollers, 3D collectathons, even racing and sports. But with Super Mario Odyssey, Nintendo reminded everyone why he remains gaming's most enduring icon. It wasn't about reinventing Mario. It was about perfecting it. This game distilled decades of platforming history into one polished, endlessly creative adventure that showed that AAA didn't always need grit or drama. Sometimes it just needed joy. The hook was Cappy, a mechanic so simple yet so transformative that it instantly refreshed Mario's moveset. Tossing the hat to capture enemies turned the game into a playground of experimentation. Suddenly, a Goomba wasn't just an obstacle, it was a tool. A bullet bill wasn't a threat, it was transportation. This constant stream of new abilities kept exploration exciting, with each kingdom offering fresh surprises. But what really made Odyssey sing was its design philosophy. Instead of chasing hyper-realism or bloated systems, it embraced imagination. From the bustling cityscape of New Donk City to the surreal Luncheon Kingdom, every environment felt distinct, playful, and packed with secrets. The sheer density of power moons to collect could have felt overwhelming, but Nintendo's clever pacing made the process rewarding rather than exhausting. Of course, not everyone was on board. Some critics argued the game leaned too hard into nostalgia, with callbacks that bordered on pandering. Others felt the post-game grind for hundreds of moons stretched things a bit thin. But even with those criticisms, the overwhelming reaction was one of delight. Few games managed to make players grin from start to finish the way Odyssey did. At a time when AAA was synonymous with gritty realism, Super Mario Odyssey proved that playfulness still had a place at the top. It wasn't about pushing graphics or drama. It was about reminding players why they fell in love with games in the first place. When GoldenEye 007 dropped on the N64, it rewrote what was possible for shooters on consoles. Up until then, first-person shooters belonged to the PC crowd. Games like Doom and Quake ruled the genre. GoldenEye proved that a shooter could thrive in your living room, with a controller in hand, without sacrificing depth or fun. The campaign set the tone, and it wasn't just a corridor shooter. It gave players objectives. Plant a modem, rescue a hostage, disable alarms. Suddenly, missions felt tactical and immersive, making you feel like an actual secret agent instead of a trigger-happy soldier. The level design balanced freedom with direction, letting players experiment with stealth or go guns blazing. For a licensed movie tie-in, expectations were rock bottom, yet Rare delivered something that rivaled the best shooters of its time. Of course, what really etched GoldenEye into history was its multiplayer. 4 friends, 1 TV, split screen, all of it. Everyone remembers banning Oddjob, fighting over the golden gun, and memorizing every inch of facility. It was simple compared to today's online shooters, but the raw fun of those sessions helped define the social side of console gaming. Without GoldenEye, there's no Halo LAN parties, no Call of Duty dominating living rooms. That said, revisiting GoldenEye now can be rough. The frame rate dips into single digits, the aiming feels archaic, and the controls were clearly designed before dual analog sticks became the standard. It's clunky, and for players raised on modern shooters, it can feel unplayable. But back then, none of that mattered. It was groundbreaking. This game showed the world that console shooters could be, and it took FPS out of the PC niche and pushed it towards the mainstream. Its flaws may stand out today, but its influence is undeniable. It made shooters a pillar of AAA gaming. By 2022, the Pokemon series was showing its age. Despite its global popularity, the formula hadn't changed much in decades. Catch monsters, fight gyms, save the world. Pokemon Legends Arceus broke that cycle. It wasn't perfect, but it dared to rethink how a franchise built on routine could feel fresh. And in doing so, it reminded people what AAA risks are supposed to look like. The game stripped away much of the modern Pokemon comfort zone. Exploration became the focus, with players sneaking through tall grass, crafting items, and carefully observing wild Pokemon before even thinking about catching them. Battles still mattered, but they weren't the only way forward. For the first time in years, Pokemon felt unpredictable. The game's strengths came from that sense of discovery. Sneaking up on an alpha Pokemon, dodging their attacks in real time, or surveying a new biome gave the series a level of immersion it had always lacked. It wasn't just about collecting creatures. It was about surviving alongside them. Even the Pokédex became more engaging, requiring actual research rather than a single catch. But the flaws were undeniable. Visually, the game looked dated, with flat textures and awkward animations. Towns felt bare bones, and the story leaned heavily on predictable beats. Some longtime fans missed the traditional gym structure, while others felt the stealth mechanics could have been fleshed out more. Yet those issues didn't overshadow the boldness of the experiment. RC has proved that even the most conservative AAA franchises could reinvent themselves. It wasn't flawless, but it was brave, and that bravery made it one of the most refreshing Pokemon experiences in years. Sometimes, AAA isn't about perfection. It's about daring to shake up the formula, even if it stumbles along the way. Before 2007, Call of Duty was a solid but predictable series. Then Modern Warfare arrived, and suddenly the whole industry felt different. Gone were the familiar trenches and Normandy landings. Infinity Ward dropped players into a gritty, contemporary conflict that felt ripped from headlines. It wasn't just a new setting. It was a reinvention of what AAA shooters could be. The campaign hit hard. Missions like All Gillied Up turned stealth into art, while shock and awe and that infamous nuke scene proved that games could deliver gut punch moments every bit as shocking as cinema. The pacing was tight, bouncing between globetrotting action and tense, grounded firefights. For the first time, a shooter didn't just feel like target practice. It felt like spectacle, carefully choreographed to keep players hooked. But it was multiplayer that cemented Modern Warfare's place in history. The perks system, customizable loadouts, and addictive progression loop created a formula that dominated online gaming for years. Every match gave you something new to chase, whether it was a weapon unlock, a kill streak reward, or just bragging rights. It was fast, competitive, and, importantly, easy to jump into, setting the standard for what online AAA gaming would become. That said, it wasn't flawless. The story, while thrilling, leaned heavily on stereotypes and shock factor, and multiplayer had its fair share of balance issues. Grenade spams were a good example. Yet even those rough edges became part of the shared experience. Modern Warfare wasn't just a hit, it was a turning point. It pushed shooters into the mainstream, proved that online modes could define a blockbuster, and lay the groundwork for the yearly franchise model that still dominates today. Love it or hate it, the AAA industry has been living in its shadow ever since. Go. Final Fantasy VII's release in '97 was a cultural shift. Before this game, RPGs were often seen as a niche genre, mostly reserved for the diehards willing to wade through chunky pixels and text-heavy dialogue boxes. Then along came FF7, and a story so ambitious that it proved video games could carry the same emotional weight as a movie. That infamous opening in Midgar, with its cinematic camera angles and swelling soundtrack, immediately told players, this wasn't business as usual. The jump from 2D sprites to 3D characters might look rough now, but at the time, those blocky models were revolutionary. Combine them with pre-rendered backdrops and full-motion video cutscenes, and you suddenly had something that felt epic in scale. For many players in the West, this was their very first RPG, and the leap in production value made it impossible to ignore. Final Fantasy VII didn't just sell consoles. It made the PlayStation the place for big-budget experiences. Of course, it wasn't flawless. The translation is infamous for awkward lines that sometimes undermine the story's seriousness. The materia system, while clever, could feel grindy, and random encounters dragged pacing down. Even back then, some critics pointed out that much of the hype came from spectacle rather than polish. Yet those flaws didn't matter in the grand scheme, because the ambition was undeniable. Most importantly, this showed publishers what AAA could be. It wasn't just about gameplay anymore, it was about experience. It convinced the industry that players wanted games with movie-like cutscenes, sprawling worlds, and stories that took themselves seriously. That's the DNA you can still see in modern blockbusters like The Witcher 3 or Final Fantasy 16. Without this release, the idea of games being so cinematic might not exist at all. After release, it was quickly obvious that Red Dead Redemption 2 was one of the most meticulously crafted games ever made. This wasn't just a Western. It was a living, breathing world that demanded players slow down and soak in the details. From the way Arthur Morgan scribbled in his journal to the way snow crunched underfoot, everything in this game felt deliberate, like it had been built not just to be seen, but to be lived in. What set RDR2 apart was its commitment to immersion. Every action, from skinning an animal to cleaning your guns, was slowed to a pace that contrasted sharply with most fast-moving blockbusters. Some players found that frustrating, but for others it was part of the magic. The game asked you to exist in its world rather than rush through it. That world, with its sprawling plains, swamps, and mountains, wasn't just a backdrop. It was the real main character. Arthur himself, though, gave the story its heart. Unlike many stoic video game protagonists, he was deeply flawed, yet deeply human. His gradual transformation, from loyal gang enforcer to a man questioning his choices, was as nuanced as anything seen in gaming. The gang's decline mirrored Arthur's own struggles, blending personal and epic storytelling into one tragic arc. Still, RDR2 wasn't without its critics. Some players thought the controls were clunky, the pacing dragged, and the endless animations tested patience. Others felt its obsession with realism occasionally came at the expense of fun. Yet even those frustrations underscored what made the game so bold. It dared to reject convenience in favor of authenticity. Red Dead Redemption 2 redefined AAA by proving that detail could be the story. It wasn't about speed or spectacle. It was about weight and consequence. For better or worse, it set a new bar for how immersive a digital world could feel. By 2018, the God of War series had a reputation: bombastic, over-the-top action drenched in violence and spectacle. Fun, yes, but also one note. When Santa Monica Studio rebooted the franchise, nobody expected what they delivered. A slower, more intimate journey that didn't just modernize Kratos. It redefined what AAA action games could aim for. The biggest change was tone. Instead of pure rage, Kratos was now burdened with fatherhood, guiding Atreus through a mythological world steeped in Norse lore. That relationship became the beating heart of the game, grounding the spectacle in something deeply human. It was still violent and epic, but the emotional weight gave the story staying power beyond the action. Players weren't just fighting gods. They were watching a father and son struggle to understand each other. Mechanically, the game traded its chaotic, button-mashing combat for a heavier, more deliberate system centered around the Leviathan axe. Every swing had weight, and recalling the axe mid-fight never got old. Combined with clever puzzles and semi-open exploration, the new design gave battles a more tactical edge, while still delivering jaw-dropping set pieces. That said, it wasn't flawless. Some players missed the wild freedom of the older games, and the single-camera approach, while cinematic, could feel restrictive. The RPG-style gear system divided fans. Some loved the depth, others felt it cluttered what had once been straightforward. But none of that overshadowed the fact that this was a series reborn. The God of War reboot became the poster child for how to reinvent a franchise without losing its soul. It balanced character-driven storytelling with AAA spectacle, proving you could have emotional depth and blockbuster action in the same package. It wasn't just Kratos' redemption, it was the franchise's too.
150 winters.
When The Last of Us released in 2013, it was already clear that Naughty Dog knew how to make cinematic games. But this wasn't just another action adventure. It was a gut punch of a story that blended brutal survival gameplay with one of the most human narratives the medium had seen. At a time when AAA games were leaning heavily on spectacle, The Last of Us slowed everything down and put raw emotion at the center. The world was bleak, sure, but it wasn't the apocalypse itself that grabbed players. It was Joel and Ellie. Their relationship gave weight to every moment, from quiet conversations to frantic battles. Few games dared to make players sit with uncomfortable silences or watch characters break down in subtle ways. The now famous opening sequence alone showed players this wasn't just about zombies. It was about people trying, and often failing, to hold on to their humanity. Gameplay-wise, The Last of Us was solid but unremarkable. Stealth, scavenging, and crafting kept tension high, but they weren't revolutionary. Enemies could feel predictable, and gunplay was serviceable more than polished. But that didn't matter because the mechanics existed to serve the story. Every bullet counted, every brutal takedown felt desperate, and that scarcity drove home the tone. Of course, not everyone loved it. Some players found the pacing too slow, and the heavy reliance on cutscenes sparked debates about whether it was more movie than game. But that was the risk Naughty Dog took, and it paid off. The game proved that AAA storytelling could be raw, heartbreaking, and still commercially successful. Its influence can't be overstated. It showed studios that audiences wanted mature, emotionally driven stories, and it became the model for countless narrative-driven blockbusters that followed. For many, The Last of Us wasn't just a great game. It was proof that games could break your heart as effectively as any film or novel.
For humans.
By 2015, open-world games were everywhere, but The Witcher 3 managed to stand out by doing something most of them ignored. It treated writing and narrative choice as seriously as combat and exploration. CD Projekt Red didn't just give players a massive world. They filled it with stories that mattered. And that's why it quickly became a new gold standard for RPGs. What made The Witcher 3 special wasn't just its size, it was the quality of the content. Side quests weren't filler. They were some of the best writing in the entire game. The Bloody Baron storyline is still talked about years later, not just because it was emotional, but because it gave players meaningful choices with real consequences. That level of detail extended across the whole experience. Politics, personal drama, even monster contracts felt like they had weight. At the same time, the world itself was stunning. From the war-torn swamps of Velen to the bustling streets of Novigrad, every region felt alive. Combined with Gwent, alchemy, monster hunting, and romances, the game overflowed with systems that made the world feel deep and lived in. It wasn't just a map packed with icons. It was a narrative playground. Of course, The Witcher 3 wasn't perfect. Combat, while serviceable, often felt stiff compared to its contemporaries. Inventory management could be a headache, and the game was notoriously buggy at launch. But players forgave these issues because the storytelling carried so much weight. Few AAA games at the time dared to put narrative above spectacle, and fewer still pulled it off. Its legacy is clear. The Witcher 3 raised expectations for how much care should go into side quests and narrative design. It proved that open-world RPGs didn't have to sacrifice story for scale, and it forced competitors to rethink how they approached writing. In a sea of big-budget releases, this was the one that reminded everyone why storytelling matters. By the time Skyrim launched in 2011, Bethesda had already built a reputation for sprawling RPGs, but this one hit a different level. It wasn't just a game, it was a phenomenon. Overnight, Skyrim became the kind of title everyone talked about, even outside the typical RPG audience. It wasn't because of one single mechanic or a perfect story. It was because Skyrim handed players freedom on a scale that felt almost limitless. The moment you stepped out of the tutorial cave and saw the wide open world, the rules of AAA RPGs seemed to change. You weren't forced down a single path. You could ignore the main quest entirely and just explore, picking flowers, joining guilds, or accidentally stumbling into a dragon battle. That freedom of choice became the real selling point. Bethesda's world design was so vast and reactive that players carved out their own stories, whether that meant role-playing as a thief, a wandering bard, or a dragon-slaying hero. But with that ambition came plenty of cracks. The bugs and glitches became almost as iconic as the dragons themselves, and the combat, clunky even at launch, never lived up to the immersive world around it. NPCs repeated the same stiff dialogue, and quests could feel shallow once the wonder wore off. By most critical measures, Skyrim wasn't flawless. It was messy, sometimes broken, and often repetitive. And yet, none of that mattered. The modding community exploded, keeping the game alive with everything from graphic overhauls to completely new quest lines. The sheer volume of things to do made it easy to forgive the flaws, because no two players ever had the exact same experience. That's what made it legendary. Skyrim redefined AAA by proving that freedom itself could be the centerpiece of a game. Its influence is everywhere. Open-world RPGs today are still chasing the feeling of stepping into that snowy wilderness with no limits on what comes next.